Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Victober, a month-long celebration of Victorian literature. This celebration has been happening on BookTube for quite a while now, quite a few years. It's a venerable BookTube event. I love it. I eagerly wait for it every year because I consider the Victorian era to be the greatest outpouring of human creativity in the history of the species. Not just literature. Certainly all forms of literature. Drama, nonfiction, memoir, history, fiction, poetry, but also everything else. Just there was something in the air during this period. I'm not actually naive enough to associate it with Queen Victoria. I like to joke along those lines. I don't actually know what it was. It could be a greater increase in general literacy rates, a slight increase in free time. No idea. I've never really looked into it, but I think that it's true everywhere in the world, not just in England and Ireland. I think it's true all over the world. You see a Victorian era flourishing in French literature, in especially Russian literature, and also in America, where there was a huge renaissance in American literature, to coin a term, during these exact years, from roughly the 1840s to roughly the turn of the 20th century. And I usually leave the Americans out of Victober because there's so many, there's so many British Victorians to deal with. But my reading on Project Gutenberg has led me to an American figure that I really like. I always love encountering him in the very old biographies that I read. He's a Boston figure. His name is George William Curtis. He was cheek by jowl with the Boston Brahmin aristocracy for the whole of his lifetime. Had all of the usual progressive Boston Brahmin views at the time about equal rights for women, equal rights for minorities, voting rights, all that sort of thing. Literacy rates, fair play for copyright, you name it, and he was probably on the right side of that issue. He married the sister of Robert Gould Shaw, of the famous Shaw Memorial here in Boston that I will drag you to if you ever come to visit me. And he knew all of the literary figures of his day. He's not Victorian in the straight Victober sense of the word, but he was definitely part of this general renaissance that I'm talking about. And he wrote, in addition to writing policy papers for political candidates or for presidents, and in addition to giving speeches and being on boards, and he was just one of these universally respected men of letters, he also wrote periodical pieces the whole of his life. As I've mentioned many times on this channel, no matter how illustrious you become, if you ever break your teeth doing that, you never stop doing it. No matter what. You can be a grand old retiree on Capri with a steady flow of money coming in from that one hit book you wrote. And you're still going to be writing book reviews because you're going to remember when that 20 pounds made the difference between supper and no supper. You're going to remember that, and you're going to keep doing it. Almost as if you were afraid of offending the gods. And George William Curtis did that for the whole of his career. He was constantly writing pieces for Putnam Magazine or Harper's or whatever, wherever he knew the editor or wherever a piece was wanting. And over the course of his career, he collected these pieces in a number of books. Probably the most popular book that he did was the Potiphar Papers. In his own day, he's completely forgotten now. No one would ever reprint George Curtis. No one would ever do that. I wish they would, but no one would ever do it. He'll never get a biography. In the modern day, in the 21st century, never in a million years. Much less, a selected or collected works. I don't think it would be hard to collect the whole of his works into one big fat volume. But no one even knows who he is anymore. But once upon a time, people did. And so he would collect his works periodically. And in addition to the Potiphar Papers and a bunch of other stuff that he did, he also did a collection of occasional pieces. So not just literary stuff, called From the Easy Chair. And that did really well. People were... He had a readership anyway, and people were grateful to get it. They were glad to see this for the same reason that once upon a time, these deadline prose collections were popular, because your readers were not always able to get the original issues. That makes perfect sense. I don't know what's going to happen to that in the 21st century. It doesn't seem like there's a taste for it. it seems like it's a harder and harder thing to pitch to publishers, that sort of collection, even though the reason still applies. The people who love reading you, will not have seen all your earlier publications. And yet, look at all the examples of fairly prominent, for instance, late 20th century literary critics who, they don't have that volume, and I only assume it's because they have been told by their agent or their business manager that no one would want it, that it wouldn't sell. I mean, Kakutani was the lead reviewer for New York Times for a long time. She could make or break a literary debut. She could help or significantly hinder a literary career. Where is her big book? And I could go down the list. There are a number of critics like that, working today or no longer working, but with no collection of their work. So, although no one remembers George Curtis now, he did have these books, and From the Easy Chair did well. So he came out with a couple of other volumes. And the one that I read, I was going to reread just the explicitly literary bits last night. I ended up rereading all of it. It's just so good. I chose From the Easy Chair Volume 2 here. But I'm pretty sure that Project Gutenberg has almost everything this author ever wrote. So if you don't have the hometown luxury of walking by his old house every day when you're walking your dog, for instance, his people were deeply ingrained, had deep roots in a particular neighborhood of Greater Boston. You could still find his work. You don't need to go to an antiquarian book fair. His stuff is free on Project Gutenberg. And the thing, I want to read you just a bit here. I don't know how much George Curtis will interest anybody, but I want to read you just a bit from one of his essays, just to give you a sense of what he was like, to read. Just a couple of little passages here on Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Curtis family, the Shaw family, they knew Thoreau and the Emersons. These families all knew each other. And he writes an essay here about Emerson, and it's lovely. Just lovely. Some of the rest of the stuff that's collected in these volumes, these From the Easy Chair volumes, is topical. It's time sensitive. It's dated. Not all of it will be just an open door for you to get to know this author, but I believe ruminating about Emerson will do that. He writes at one point, Emerson is associated with the tranquil landscape of the old Middlesex town, the gentle hills, the long sweep of meadowland, the winding river, the woodland, and the pastures under the ample sky. The broad horizon and rural repose were the fitting home of the lofty and beneficent genius whose life and word perpetually illustrated the supreme worth and beauty of truth, purity, and morality. Whoever saw him there or elsewhere saw the, quote, sweet and virtuous soul, which George Herbert likened to seasoned timber that never gives. So you have not only an affectionate portrait of Emerson in the wild, Emerson walking along a New England field, but also the effortless skill at allusion and quotation that the Victorian era, not just in Victorian London, but the Victorian era just in general, managed so well, so much better than anybody, so much better than any other time period. I have one other Emerson bit here, and then I'll leave off because there's only so much you can do right with George Curtis. You're not going to know about him, but he might interest you to read, especially since his work is free. He's talking about Emerson still, and mentioning something that often frustrates Emerson fans, which is that there's no real school of Emerson. There's no real school of thought. He was a flinty individual in his own lifetime, and remains one. Here, at one point, Curtis writes, he eluded the precise classification as noiselessly and surely as a cloud changes its form. Astonishment, satire, indignation, contradiction spent themselves in vain. Like a rose tree in June, which blossoms sweetly whether the air be chilly or sunny, his thought quietly flowered into exquisite expression. You might like it or leave it, but the rose would still be the same. That is lovely. I think that's lovely. And that is all through this volume. It's not, in fairness, not all of it is as accessible as that. There's quite a bit of it that is about local concerns or that is trivial. Oftentimes, magazines would want a recognized intellectual to toss off a piece of a trifle, a piece of fun. I think there's a charm in those things anyway, but the only reason they would work now would be if someone wrote a big biography of George William Curtis. I don't think anyone's ever going to do that. It's a shame, because there's plenty there. Plenty. And as I always say on these Victober videos, there's plenty that's never been consulted. There are literary remains, architectural remains, even archaeological remains all over Boston, including about a minute from my front door. There are literary remains here and in New York that have never been consulted by anyone who wants to do a full-dress biography of this person, much less a popular biography. And I don't mean to just resort to frustration over and over again, but you'd think that would happen. George Curtis had so-called right opinions about literally everything that he dealt with in his life. You'd think that would make him palatable to even the censorious 21st century. Not that we need that, right? You don't need an author to be historically prescient to be worth reading about. But it helps. It helps in the censorious 21st century. We are surrounded by scolding schoolmarms. So the fact that George Curtis was, to use the horrible, horrible expression of modern times, he was on the right side of history. You'd think that would make a biography easier to sell. But the works are still there, and the works are free. So that's going to be my Victober, my unconventional Victober pick for today as an American. But I will go back across the pond next time. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.